Huge thank you to CIBC for making We Get It possible. Hi, welcome to a new episode of We Get It. My name is Karine Chalifour. I'm the Program Director with Young Adult Cancer Canada. Thank you for joining us for this new episode. This season, we've actually changed things up a little bit, as you will notice. We will bring you every week, every Monday night, 7 p.m., we will bring you sessions that we have recorded and edited from our past events, sessions that are with amazing health professionals and friends across the country, some stories from Yackers as well. And we will talk about issues that are, we know, real things and real issues for the young adults we work with, and for topics like fear of cancer recurrence, body image, movement and exercise, mindfulness, legacy, palliative care. We are going to touch on a bunch of content. So we hope that those sessions are going to provide you with information and tools to help you live life and love life, and hope you get to join us every week and share with anyone who could be interested. So let's start now with this next episode of We Get It. Enjoy.
Good morning, everyone. Let's dive right in. My objectives for the talk today are to recognize, or to discuss with you and help you recognize, the long-term health risks associated with cancer treatments in adolescents and young adult cancer survivors. And I'm going to use the word survivor as a blanket term to describe anyone who has ever been diagnosed with cancer and is still alive today. Another goal would be to discuss the role of exercise in optimizing health and survival, identifying barriers to exercise, as well as discussing some strategies to overcome them. And we'll get into how to develop an exercise plan to safely either begin or increase your levels of exercise. So looking first at the heavy stuff. This is the less pleasant part of the conversation, so I won't dwell on it too much. We know that from the time of diagnosis, no two individuals' cancer experience or cancer trajectory looks the same. And in fact, they can be quite different from one another. Unfortunately, we know that about 75% of people who are diagnosed at a young age will develop some sort of chronic disease by the age of 40. And approximately 50% of long-term cancer survivors experience some degree of moderate to extremely diminished health status. When we look at the common symptoms, side effects that are reported in young adults, we see cancer-related fatigue as a big one. Cardiovascular disease is another really important issue to consider. Cardiovascular disease risk factors like high blood pressure is also quite common. Other functional disabilities, poor physical health, as well as poor mental health. These things are all quite commonly reported by young adults who have been diagnosed with cancer. And when we look at these different conditions, we see that they're not just straightforward single item issues, they're complex. And they often have overlapping mechanisms of risk factors that predispose you to them or to developing them, as well as injury. So let's look at a couple of the more common ones now. Starting with cancer-related fatigue. When we think about what factors contribute to cancer-related fatigue, we would typically start by thinking about people's red blood cell status, so whether or not they're anemic, whether there's chronic inflammation, immune dysregulation, if they've had any recent changes in their medication, or if they're living with chronic pain. We know emotional distress is a huge contributor to people experiencing fatigue. Physical impairments can be another major factor involved, as well as things like sleep disturbances, nutritional disorders, and any other accompanying diseases. Now, this is less often the case in younger adults who are otherwise well, but it may be the case for you. Now looking at cardiovascular disease, so to look at the complexity there, to try and overcome cancer-related fatigue, you can see how it's not such a cut and dry issue. Same thing for cardiovascular disease. We know that cancer treatments have direct negative effects on the heart, on the blood vessels, on our organ function, on our body mass and body composition, as well as it causes skeletal muscle function changes, and even at a very small level, even down to the mitochondria, which produce our energy. So if we sort of step back for a minute and think about and appreciate, in a way, how complex these things are, it may be a little daunting. And our current inability to prevent and treat some of these conditions leads to an excessive and increase in suffering and disability, increased health utilization and cost, and increased mortality risks in young adults. Now, those were just two of the things that cancer survivors often experience. And when we sort of step back and think of the broader scope of what people experience, I kind of bucket them into these like physical health risk categories, mental health risk categories. We know that these things are related to one another, and having developed one can predispose you to developing the other. We also know there's these multifaceted health risks or health issues. And like same thing, these conditions are often interrelated to one another and have similar pathways and mechanisms of risk. So dealing with that can be quite complex. So what can we do then? Is there anything you can do to help overcome the tremendous burden and barrier that cancer imposes in your life? Oh yeah, there is. And that's exactly why I'm going to be cheesy and get through this cheesy part quickly, but that's exactly why I'm here talking to you today. So the complexity of these conditions actually has plays to our favor in a way. First off, the complexity and the interrelatedness of these conditions creates a strong rationale for looking at therapies that have multi-system benefits. Because if things are related to one another, if we can improve a couple of them, there may be related improvements in the other conditions. So we can use these relationships to our advantage. But to be real for a minute, I'm not proposing that exercise is a magic bullet. It's not some snake oil tonic that will be a cure-all. It requires work. But if you do it right, every single dose of exercise can simultaneously affect almost every system and structure in your body. There is no drug on the market that, if it was this beneficial, it wouldn't be approved and highly recommended to everybody under the sun. Okay, so exercise has a real important role to play in addressing some of the complex issues experienced by young adult cancer survivors. And if we just use these two examples of the risks and complications, the contributing factors to cardiovascular disease and fatigue, and we map those risk pathways onto what we know from exercise physiology, we see that exercise improves cardiorespiratory fitness, improves cardiac and pulmonary function, and I'm intentionally drawing this out to really drive the point home here. It improves vascular and microvascular structure and function. It improves skeletal muscle mass and function, red blood cells, mitochondrial density, oxidative energy production, decreases obesity, improves glucose metabolism, improves your anti-inflammatory defenses. The list goes on and on. I'm hoping the point is clear. These are complex issues that have multiple competing factors contributing to them, but doing one thing, exercise, I'll say that's one thing. We know it can be a little more complex than that, but just doing one thing has multi-system benefits that can address many of the pathways underlying these conditions. All right, now let's look at a little bit of some data. Does anyone have any questions at this point? And could someone flag? I'm not, no, we're good. All right. So looking at some evidence from the literature related to some things that may be of interest to you. So a colleague of mine from New York actually recently published this sort of review, and it talks about the effect of exercise on how tumors grow and how they spread. So we see in people who are sedentary, their internal environment, so this blue box here, that internal environment is considered pro-cancerous. There are inflammatory factors and metabolic factors that can support the development of cancer cells and tumors. But with each individual dose of exercise, it delivers these short-term anti-inflammatory, free radical protecting sort of effects that have these short-term acute benefits. With continued exposure to an exercise stimulus, you begin to remodel the internal environment. So it's not just an acute bit of relief from inflammation and free radicals and so on. You're actually starting to get to a less pro-cancerous state. And then with continued training, you can actually work towards having an internal system that actually helps prevent or slow the progression of disease. And we see in research now, both in animal models and in humans, that exercise contributes to decreasing tumor growth and improving tumor sensitivity to receiving treatment. Another colleague of mine from New York, I think this was Allison's PhD work, if I'm not mistaken. I'll just explain what we're looking at here. If I can get my laser pointer going. Okay, so what we're looking at here, this is an animal study, and this is they grafted tumors into mice. Okay, so this is how many days after the tumor was transplanted we're looking at. This is the size of the tumor. And then there were a couple of groups that were explored. There was a group that received no treatment, just chemotherapy, just exercise and chemotherapy. And when they received chemotherapy, it was on the days that were starred here. So on day 7, 9, and 11. So let's look at the differences here. First, we see that exercise and chemotherapy had the smallest. That group had has the least amount of tumor growth over the observation period. And that growth was significantly less than in the animals that received just chemotherapy or just exercise. So there seems to be an additive benefit here. And then that growth was also much less than in animals that received no treatment. And it's also really interesting when you think about it that exercise and chemotherapy, there was really no difference between those groups, but they were both better than receiving no treatment. So a similar tumor suppression effect. Another quick anecdote, another line of animal models, and this is one of the first reasons I got into this field actually, is they did an exercise study. They did the same thing. They implanted tumors in animals. They let them grow. They trained some. They didn't train others. When they looked at tumor growth over the whatever observation period, they actually saw no difference in the size of tumors. And their concern was that actually exercise increased tumor growth. This was very early on in the line of discovery. But they saw no difference in the size of tumors. But then when they exposed one group to chemotherapy, the animals who had exercised had much larger tumor shrinkage. And what they found was when they removed those tumors, the tumors that within the exercised animals had much better blood vessel distribution, whereas the tumors in the non-exercised animals had big regions of hypoxia where there was no blood vessels and no flow, so the chemotherapy couldn't reach those parts of the tumors. So between those two examples, you see that exercise may have some tumor suppressive effects, and it actually sensitizes tumors to respond better to chemotherapy, which I think is pretty neat. Another issue commonly or of common concern is the effects of exercise on bone health and whether it can do anything for people. Now, this is a prostate cancer sample, so I appreciate these are not young adults, but there's an interesting sort of take home here. So this study was done in 60 prostate patients with spinal metastases receiving radiotherapy. They did daily gentle resistance exercise while they were or during their treatments, and they looked at bone mineral density at the site where the metastases were at 3 months and 6 months into the intervention or into the observation period. And this is just a quick picture here where you can see the image on the left. There's very little white. Hope it's coming through on your screens. There's very little white in the image on the left, whereas in the circled image on the right, within that black demarcated region, you can see that there's more white coloring there, indicating more bone growth. And what they saw is that at 3 months post-baseline, there was a 28% increase in the bone mineral density at the spinal metastasis site, which I think is tremendous. And at 6 months, there was an 80% increase in bone mineral density. So again, this is not necessarily a young adult type of cancer, but it highlights an interesting potential here for people who are living with or who may unfortunately develop bone metastases. Exercise may have a beneficial effect in helping to reinforce the structure of the bones. Some work that I did for my PhD actually looked at the cardiovascular benefits of exercise in testicular cancer survivors. We saw there was a major increase in cardiorespiratory fitness. This is an important prognostic marker for survival in oncology, in cancer survivors. We saw a significant improvement in the Framingham risk score, which is a traditional cardiovascular disease risk score sort of measurement. But now let's go beyond these sort of less or more abstract things into like the specific systems and structures that were affected. This was just a 12-week intervention, by the way. So it decreased the thickness and the stiffness of the carotid blood vessel. It increased the brachial artery diameter. It improved microvascular reactivity in the periphery. It decreased central and peripheral arterial stiffness. It improved 3 different markers of autonomic nervous system control over the heart. And it improved blood-based biomarkers, including inflammation and lipoprotein. This was just 12 weeks of intervention. And in that 12 weeks, we decreased the prevalence of cardiovascular disease risk factors in our sample by 20%. There is no drug on the market that can do that for you. Now let's look at fatigue, another big one, another heavy hitter in this space. This is from the same study, a different paper, but the same study. So what this graph represents, so I can get my laser pointer back up here. What this graph represents is similar fatigue score at baseline. Higher fatigue scores on this measurement scale indicate less fatigue, so better fatigue, okay? And lower scores indicate worse fatigue or more fatigue. So you can see that at post-intervention, so at 12 weeks, there was a significant improvement in fatigue in our exercise group. And then when we stopped intervening with them and just let them do what they wanted to do for the next 3 months, that improvement was maintained. And that's a very similar pattern to what we saw using a different measure. So vitality in this SF36 scale is a quality of life related fatigue measurement. And you can see the same pattern of change happened here. So quality of life related fatigue, same thing. It improved at post-intervention and stayed significantly increased over time. Another study of interest of ours that we actually performed using data from the Childhood Cancer Survivorship Study. So these are adult survivors of pediatric cancers. They were treated between 1970 and 1999. It was an average of about 18 years between when they were diagnosed and when we were first sort of interacting with them. At baseline, their baseline questionnaires sample was done in 1992. We had data on 15,000 individuals, and we looked at the relationship between exercise and mortality at 20 years of follow-up. We were also interested not just in that baseline interaction, but the relationship between what happens if you change your activity, your exercise behavior over time. Is there any benefit there? So we also looked at this secondary change in exercise over about an 8 to 10 year period. So we had a second follow-up time point between 2002, 2005. We had data in about 5,500 individuals at that point, and we looked at mortality rates after that. And this is in a very sort of distilled way. This is what we found. So remember the first question. The first question was, what was the relationship between vigorous exercise and mortality at 20 years follow-up? We found that compared to people who were doing no vigorous exercise or vigorous physical activity, individuals doing 15 to 18 met hours of work per week had a 42% reduction in mortality risk. And 15 to 18 met hours of work per week may make you think I'm crazy and that I want you to do something for 15 or find 15 to 18 extra hours in your week. That is not the case. I'll explain what met hours are in a minute. But just keep in mind what this relationship is. That translates in practical terms, 15 to 18 met hours of work per week translates to playing badminton or soccer for an hour, dancing for 30 minutes 2 times a week, and biking for 30 minutes 2 times a week. A simpler way to look at it, it's the equivalent of hiking or playing a sport for, say, 2 to 3 hours a week. That's how much vigorous exercise we're talking about. But remember, we're also interested in looking at the change in vigorous exercise behavior. So what if you weren't doing anything and started doing something over that 8-year period? We found that just an increase of just 6 met hours of work per week was associated with a 40% risk reduction in mortality. That's the equivalent of hiking for 30 minutes twice a week or climbing stairs for 15 minutes 3 times a week. So we're not talking about a ton of work. And what's really important about that last question that we asked is that it's never too late. Even if you're not doing anything now, you still have time. Work towards changing your behavior, and you can still benefit dramatically from it. A 40% risk reduction in mortality. So now the obvious question is, how do I protect myself? Some key questions that I get asked and that I see that several people had submitted to YAC ahead of time relate to wondering what kinds of exercises they should be doing, how much exercise they need to do, and how strenuous the exercise needs to be in order to be beneficial. So starting with the first one, what kinds of exercises do we need to be doing? I'm going to draw from my colleague Margie McNeely out in Edmonton or in Calgary, or she's in Edmonton, yep. She described this, and I love the description. If we're going to generalize about what the general benefits of these types of activities are, aerobic exercises can be considered the living long exercises, and resistance training as well as stretching and aerobic-based exercise can be considered living well types of exercises. Keep those in mind because we're going to come back to those different training approaches in a couple of slides here. But then the next question is, how much exercise do I need to do? And with a little experience, I've come to understand that what people are really asking is, what is the least amount of exercise I can do and still derive some benefit from it? So we have to talk in general terms, but the real answer to that question depends on what your outcome of interest is. But we see that for people who are doing no exercise, so 0 to 2 met hours of work per week, there's really no change. If I can pull this back up, there's really no change in measures of health complications or measures of health benefits. But when you get into this minimum dose range, you start to see health complications decrease and health benefits increase. But based on the available evidence today, there seems to be an optimal range somewhere between 9 and 27 met hours of work per week that seems to be associated with the best sort of return on your investment in terms of reducing health risks and improving health outcomes. But again, what the heck are these met hours of work per week? One metabolic equivalent, so 1 met hour, is the equivalent of how much energy you are all expending right now listening to me drone on and on. A met A MET hour is essentially describes the energy costs of different activities. And the MET value for these different activities is considered a multiple of your resting metabolic rate. But let's get specific. This is still a bit abstract right now. So how specifically do we use this? So there are MET activity values that have been measured for all sorts of different activities, and I'll show you some of those soon. These MET activity values have been measured. So you multiply the MET activity value, say for a slow walk, a normal pace walk, the MET value is 3. So you would multiply the MET value of the activity by the duration of the activity in hours, not in minutes, and then how many times you perform that activity per week. So a quick example, moving from a slow walk to a brisk walk. A brisk walk is a MET value of 4. So let's say you go for a 15-minute walk, but that's in hours, that's only 0.25, right? You go for a brisk walk for 15 minutes, either 2 times a day, 3 days a week, or 1 time a day, 6 days a week. So a 15-minute walk, 6 days a week. The math there is 4 times 0.25 times the frequency. So 6. So what MET value do we end up at there? Just by going for a brisk walk for 15 minutes, 6 times a week, you have accrued 6 MET hours of work. Remember, that was the level of vigorous intensity activity that was associated with a significant improvement in survival. So I'll show you a little tool. So this is called the Compendium of Physical Activities. It's a Google site. I've provided the link to this in the handout. So this is a good way to go and look up the MET values for your different favorite physical activities. And you can see that they have things that are pretty standard, like biking and conditioning and dancing, home repair, activities around the house, as well as some more risque things like sexual activity. They even have religious activities measured. So find your sort of typical sort of sweet spot for what types of activities you want to do, then you can find what the MET activity value for those activities are. Okay, and then you would use that in the equation here. We're going to jump back to, there we go. So then you would use that MET value and plug it in at the beginning to calculate how many MET hours you are accruing per week for that activity. So that brings those scary numbers of 15 to 18 MET hours of work per week back into within reach, right? I would argue that even if you can't do it right now, with a bit of time and a bit of effort, you can work towards achieving this. Especially so if you're not doing anything right now, vigorous physical activity wise, and you're looking to add 6 MET hours of work per week. This is definitely doable for everybody on the call, regardless of your current physical condition. The next question is, how strenuous does this exercise need to be? And what we see is that intensity does seem to matter. Now, you will still benefit at different intensities, but there seems to be a little bit more benefit for if you're able to work a little harder. So all this data is the moderate intensity data is just the average benefits reported in the literature in different reviews. And this is the benefits that we saw in our HIT training study in testicular cancer survivors. And it's an indirect comparison, so don't sort of hang your hat on this. But indirectly, we see that there seems to be this greater return on your investment if you're able to work a little bit harder. And there are several other papers that sort of support that contention as well. So intensity does matter, but it's also very personal. Let's take a brisk walk at 3.5 miles an hour. It has a MET value of approximately 3.8 or 4. But we know for any 2 individuals, my colleague Maddie, I think she's on the call right now. So if Maddie was to go for a brisk walk at 3.5 miles an hour, it would be very easy for her. She would tap into a very low percentage of her overall fitness. Whereas if I was trying to keep up with her on that same brisk walk, I'd be working really hard. And this is the case for everyone. So know that performing the same activity as your friend, or planning the intensity of your workouts based on what other people do, is not the right approach. You want to be doing it based on your current abilities and your current conditioning status. Because what would be hard for me today, if I started training regularly, would get easier and easier and easier, and eventually it would be not taxing for me to do it all. And this will be another place where my colleague Maddie, who's I think on the call still, will be able to chime in, because she's an expert in all this stuff. So looking at barriers and some strategies to overcome them. So how many people on the call relate to this? How many people have time-related barriers? Time-related barriers are a big one. Social life, work, school, family obligations, sometimes very challenging to overcome. Anyone relate to these? Having symptoms that are preventing them from being physically active, whether it's fatigue or they're in physical pain of some sort. Motivation-related barriers are real barriers, and they are tough to overcome sometimes. Whether you just don't like exercise, and that happens. I certainly don't like all types of exercise. Or you're just feeling unmotivated that day, or you feel like you don't have the willpower to engage with the activity. There are environment-related barriers, whether it's, as we know in Canada, inclement weather, or going to gyms, where that can be pretty intimidating for some people. Especially when you see the ridiculous stuff that happens at some of those gyms. Fear-related barriers. People who have tried to get active in the past and have not been successful in it, or were successful for a period and then found themselves unable to maintain. Those can be big challenges, as well as knowledge-related barriers. There's so many conflicting sources of information out there. It's tough to know what to trust, where to draw the reliable info from, and so on. So let's unpack a couple of these. Starting with time-related barriers. People on the call likely either back at work, on disability, thinking about returning to work. Many of you have had some degree of schooling that, if you're in it right now, would certainly be a competing interest for your time. People who have families, who have started families themselves or a part of their own, as well as people who have a social life. I no longer have a social life, and maybe COVID might be responsible for that, but I think my lack of social life predated COVID. All of that to say, time management is so tough to achieve, and there are so many things, competing interests for our time, that need to be managed, and it can be quite challenging to overcome. So what I'd like you to do, I'd like you to sit and think about and write down, please and thank you, what your biggest time-related barriers to exercise are. So take a couple of minutes, think about and write down what you feel your biggest time-related barriers are. One of my biggest ones is family. I have 2 small kids now, and it's tough trying to find time to make time for my own exercise, until I started using one of these strategies more that we'll talk about next, while juggling work and them. All right. So some strategies to overcome some of these time-related barriers, according to the barriers themselves, are trying to find ways to build exercise into your commute to work, or what you're doing during your lunch breaks, or your shift breaks at work. That's if you're in school and are able to get back there and join some sort of team or club with your friends. I'm sure that even at U of T, not all the sports need to be vigorous ultimate frisbee running club type things. There are much more gentle activities. I see lots of yoga classes and some gentle dancing sort of classes that happen. So when we're able to get back in person, that's a good route. Building one in for family time. My 3-year-old and I have been going for 4-year-old now, and we've been going for 7 or 8 kilometer bike rides recently. Now, my heart rate doesn't really get up on those rides, whereas he's pedaling like a bat out of hell. But the point is that at the end of the day, when I've been sitting all day, even getting out for an hour to ride my bike casually is better than doing nothing. And then build it into your social life. Get active together. Find friends that have common interests and common goals, and sort of make a commitment to one another and sort of build it into what you plan to do with each other each week. There's also some emerging literature that for the people that if we're talking regular structured exercise training now, there's some emerging literature showing just how time efficient we may be able to be. So moderate intensity continuous training, that's working at a certain intensity and maintaining that intensity throughout the duration of time that you will be training. It typically takes a while, 30, 45, 60 minutes. Like this, it's typically a longer duration required. Now you can combine shorter 15-minute bouts to add up to these, but it still takes a longer total exercise time when you're working at a moderate intensity. You could also do aerobic interval training where you do, say, 4 minutes of harder work interspersed by 3 or 4 minutes of active recovery. What is really nice about this is you get the benefits of working hard and building in this recovery period, so you actually feel like your gas tank fills up a little bit. You're less distressed from working hard mentally and physically before you start trying to work hard again. And for 4 minutes or 3 minutes or 2 minutes, whatever you're able to sustain initially, you can work up to gradually increase the duration of that higher intensity work period. There's also sprint interval training, where you're training for just 20 or 30 seconds, interspersed by 3 minutes, 20 or 30 seconds interspersed by 3 minutes. And then there's these hit snacks people are talking about, where if you were doing maximal work for 20 seconds in the morning, then you go about your day. And then after 4 hours, you come back and you do another 20 seconds of maximal work and you go about your day again. So you've accrued 60 seconds of vigorous intensity work in your day, and they're still showing some benefit of that. So even if you're not able to commit to doing 30, 40, 50 minutes of moderate intensity exercise, or even 30 to 35 minutes or 10 to 15 minutes of the other types of exercise, everybody has a minute in their day. So getting up and doing something in between your bouts of sitting can be tremendously important. There's a burgeoning body of evidence showing the benefits of interrupting your sedentary periods on improving health outcomes. Symptom-related barriers are massive, and we can never predict when they're going to arrive and challenge us. They can be scary because every little ache and pain makes people think, shit, my cancer has come back. What am I doing? Is it safe for me? And these are valid concerns. It is often not the case that it's anything major, but it definitely needs to be looked at. So your first step whenever in addressing your symptom-related barriers is always going to talk to your healthcare team. And know too that even if you are, say, deconditioned, there's pretty consistent evidence that the people who are most affected, most symptomatic, or most deconditioned stand to benefit the most from engaging in exercise. So what this graph represents is people who have low levels of fitness, moderate levels of fitness, and high levels of fitness. Black indicated by the black bars indicating men, the white bars indicating people self-identifying as being women, and they're looking at the risk of death. Okay, so in people who exercise, in looking at fitness levels, you can see that the risk of death decreases the most when you go from being very unfit or having low levels of fitness to being moderately fit. So there is the most survival advantage gained going from having low levels of fitness to moderate levels of fitness. And then a little bit more benefit going from moderate levels of fitness to high levels of fitness. But you can see that making that transition from being, either low fit or unfit to moderately well conditioned has a huge survival advantage for both men and women. looking at data from one of the studies I showed earlier, looking at the impact of HIIT training on fatigue. So this is the same thing. So we looked at baseline VO2, so baseline fitness levels, same thing. People who had low levels of fitness, average levels of fitness, and high levels of fitness. And we looked at the change in fatigue over the intervention period. And you can see that the HIIT group, indicated by the white bars, compared to the usual care group, indicated by the black bars. People in the HIIT group who had low fitness at baseline had huge improvements in fatigue. So the people that were the least well-conditioned, who did the HIIT training, had massive improvements in fatigue. And even people who had average levels of fitness at baseline still had large improvements in fatigue. Similar sort of comparison, people who were doing no exercise at baseline versus those who were doing some exercise at baseline. You can see that that fatigue improved the most in individuals who were doing no exercise at baseline and started doing HIIT training. Now, these two were looking at fatigue at the end of the intervention, so at 3 months. We also looked at change in fatigue at 3-month follow-up. And we saw, very interesting, that the people who were self-reporting being clinically fatigued at baseline had the largest sustained benefit related to participating in the intervention at 3-month follow-up. So even if you have clinical levels of fatigue at baseline, by engaging in the intervention, and remember, this is 3 months after the intervention, the improvement was still there. So now I want you to sit and think about what symptoms or impairments you think may present a challenge to you in initiating and maintaining exercise. With whatever you've written down, take these to your team. If necessary, get treatment for them prior to starting exercise. At least make sure you have medical authorization to start exercise if any of these complications are significant. Motivation-related barriers. So there's in one way of looking at it, there's two types of motivation. There's intrinsic or internal motivation and extrinsic or external motivation. Intrinsic motivation relates to doing something because you're either interested in it or you enjoy doing it. These reasons are internal. They're not driven by people's perceptions or your concerns about those things might be. Extrinsic motivation involves doing something because you're told by someone you should do it. These reasons or these contributors to external motivation are external. They often require needing to achieve a goal, wanting to get some sort of reward, avoiding some sort of risk or putting yourself at a disadvantage. The challenge is that intrinsic factors are much more powerful than extrinsic factors at supporting your motivation to maintain any habit for that matter. But intrinsic factors, whether you like something or not, is pretty difficult to change. So there's less room for us to manipulate intrinsic factors, and we have to rely, just by virtue of their malleability, on extrinsic factors more. Another question, what do I need from exercise? And this can be a good source of motivation. There are many reasons people would want to get active, right? I'm sure even myself, I relate to many of the things that are on the screen right now. It starts with finding one or two really good ones for you. We don't need to worry about all of the reasons why we should be active, and I'm not shooting on anyone right now, but it's important that we try and find reasons that are personally meaningful to us, because those will be the best sources of motivation for us. And when we look at the specific benefits of exercise here, these are not all encompassing, but I told you we would come back to discussing what some of the benefits of the different training approaches are. So if we look at the general benefits of aerobic exercise, it can help with things like fatigue, improving fitness, getting back to work, improving cognitive function, decreasing your mortality risk, suppressing tumor growth, things like that. Resistance training type exercise, the data shows that it can help us. Same, you can see there's some overlap and some different things that it will help with. Improving your body image, strengthening your bones, increasing your strength, helping return to work, and so on. And then there's also stretching and yoga-based exercises. Obviously, flexibility and balance are not on this list, but those are two very obvious ones. But these types of exercises will also help with some of the other symptoms that need to be addressed, or aspects of your physical and mental health that need to be addressed. So the benefits, the take home from this is that the benefits of the different approaches to exercise are specific to the modality, but they're also complementary. So you can use them in conjunction with one another to achieve and really reinforce the potential benefits of what you're trying to achieve here. But the trick is to not overwhelm yourself. Start with one priority, one need, and one type of exercise to learn how to do to start performing in order to address that priority or need. What factors, and I can go back to that goofy list I had up earlier to give you some more ideas. What factors, what are your big motivators for wanting, or at least considering, making a change in your physical activity or exercise behavior? What are things that would you think really motivate you? All right, environment-related barriers. I alluded to this earlier. We live in Canada. Depending on where you live, Toronto's pretty soft, actually. There's very few environment-related barriers here, but I'm from Muskoka, where there's lots of snow and lots of precipitation, and I'm sure there's people from across the country on the call here, so that can be a big one. That we already talked about crowded gyms, who I don't know very many people that like to be in that space if they're really there for reasons other than socializing. So now think about the resources in your community: outdoor resources, indoor resources. I've got it a little bit blurred out, but I swapped my bookshelf for a home training sort of thing and stuck my bookshelf down at the office because the gyms are closed and I need a bit of a brain break. So what are the resources you have available to you? Even if it's a hallway with a yoga mat and a couple of dumbbells, what are the resources you have available to you that you can leverage to start getting more active? And then think too, in a critical way, which of these resources exist but you're less likely to use them, versus which ones do you think you're more likely to use? Your relationship to these resources may change too in time, right? You may try something, you may find that you previously thought you disliked it, and then if you tried something new, you may start to like it, or you may fall out of love with one of your existing resources and need to plan another approach. Fear-related barriers are challenging. Certainly, we have all started things and been unsuccessful in achieving them. And it can be really disappointing when we realize I missed the mark. I didn't stick to it. I didn't stick to myself. And it can negatively impact your self-confidence, your self-esteem. These things can be major sort of impediments to adopting a new health behavior. And for many of us, the goals seem too lofty. They seem too out of reach. And we'll talk a little bit shortly about how to sort of overcome those. What are the previous challenges that you have encountered where you have been unsuccessful in adopting a health behavior, like exercise, changing your dietary habits, anything like that? And then relatedly, what things are you concerned that you may not be successful in achieving if you were to try them? What are the things that you're sort of insecure about at the moment? Like I was saying, knowledge related barriers are a big one. There's so many conflicting sources of information out there. It's tough to know what to trust, where to get good, reliable, safe information from. Speaking mostly in Ontario terms, but I know there's great sort of similar organizations in a national context. When you are finding yourself stuck wondering what you should do next or what is safe or right for you to do, seek out some professionals, seek out the good support organizations, whether it's CSEP is a national organization for exercise physiologists. You could seek out someone who has this CSEP designation, and they have national registries where you can find people that live close to you and contact them directly. There's a College of Kinesiology in Ontario, and I'm sure similar entities in different provinces across, and certainly similarly within physiotherapy, the physiotherapy profession. It's important too to know that just because people have this designation doesn't mean they have cancer experience. So advocate for yourself, take the time, feel comfortable asking them whether or not they have experience working with someone who has a history of cancer. And don't hesitate to press them on, okay, I've told you what my concerns are, what my perceived health risks are. How are you adapting my program to deal with them? Make sure you advocate for yourself in that way, because you can't assume that just because they have a professional designation that they know exactly how to address the concerns that come with you. Other cancer exercise programs exist across the country. We have a great one at Princess Margaret called Elixir. There's Wellsprings across Canada, Thrive in Alberta, YMCAs. Some have local programs, Hope and Cope in Montreal. There are other, and those would be places where you could find cancer experience professionals to help answer some of your questions. So this is not something we're going to do now, but I want you to sort of do this at the end of our talk today to synthesize sort of what you think your most important barriers are, your most significant barriers are, and start to brainstorm some strategies to overcome them. One of the most important parts of getting started with exercise is first understanding what your barriers are, but then coming up with a plan to address them. And one of the biggest sort of aspects of that is setting goals. And if you set goals well, it can be extremely powerful in helping you achieve behavior change. But remember, a goal without a plan is just a wish. So you need to plan. Planning to achieve your goal is critically important if you're looking to change your behavior. So one way you can address sort of starting this planning piece is through a decision balance sheet, where you basically list the options of either making a change or not making a change against the benefits or pros of making that change versus the costs or cons of making that change or not making that change. So a quick example, the benefits to not changing would be you'll be more relaxed, you'll be more fun at parties, you don't have to think about your problems at all. The costs of not changing behavior might be disapproval from family and friends. There may be some money problems, damage to close relationships, increased health risks. So benefits or pros of making a behavior change: increased control of your life, better support from your family and friends, decreased job problems, improved health and fitness. And be specific with these. These are fairly generic ones, but be specific to you as to what the real benefits and challenges will be. And the costs of making a behavior change, sometimes it can be stressful, not knowing if you're going to be successful. You'll have less time available for yourself and your friends unless you build in some behavior change with your friends. New aches and pains. Oftentimes you see with prolonged, say exercise, for example, it actually helps with sleep. But these things can be differently influential for different people. So take some time to come up with whatever the thing that you want to adopt is, whether it's walking a couple times a week or what have you. You can do this sort of checklist for yourself to really help win the argument internally as to why it's important for you to be doing it. When we talk about goal setting and planning, it's really important that the goals are realistic. They should be hard enough that you have to work for them, but not so hard that they're impossible. They need to be important to you. Remember, we showed that list of all these factors why you might want to change your behavior. What would motivate you? Well, picking something because you know it's good for you often won't be important enough to really support you in adopting a behavior change. Make sure that it is a goal, that it is a reason that is truly valuable to you. These goals should be measurable. Develop goals that can be evaluated. Having something generic like walking more is tough to quantify. But if you say walking 3 days a week, it's pretty easy to check yourself as to whether or not you've achieved that. And it also needs to be specific. Even as basic as moving more versus walking more, or moving 3 days a week versus walking 3 days a week, right? Pick an activity, be specific in what you're sort of committing to yourself to try and achieve. And you should add as much detail as possible in establishing these goals. There are different types of goals, and these different types, have relationships to one another. So there's process goals. That examples are walking 10 minutes 3 times a day, or eating 5 to 7 servings of fruits and veggies. These are process goals where you're not concerned as much about the outcome, you're concerned about the process or engaging in that habit. These are typically short-term goals that you want to address first in your goal-setting behavior. There's also performance goals where you want to improve something or change something. And then there is outcome goals where you're looking to climb gross morn, or doing your first 5K race, or losing a certain amount of weight. Those would be examples of outcome goals. And those are more near-term to long-term types of goals. As I said, short-term goals typically precede or are the building blocks for achieving your long-term goals. And performance goals can also precede your eventual outcome goals. Step 1 would be to define, in goal setting, think big picture. Ultimately, what would you like to achieve? Will often be some sort of performance or an outcome goal. Some examples that we'll talk about quickly today are returning to work. And in this example, it'll be full-time employment as a landscaper. An adventure-based goal, so hiking Kilimanjaro, or some sort of sports goal like running a marathon. You got to break these down to make them realistic. So that's the second step, is identifying the important milestones that precede that bigger goal. So if you're thinking of returning to work, to returning to full-time employment as a landscaper, and if you're really deconditioned, you may need to start with a very simple, achievable goal of getting to the point where you can walk for 2 hours in a half-day period. Then you can do something that involves some carrying and lifting and standing and squatting for a 4-hour period, and then something that's a little bit more taxing, like cutting or raking the lawn for a 6-hour period. These are measurable, they're achievable, and they're systematically increased in intensity. Same thing for your adventure. Maybe you want to start with some sort of process goal that will help you achieve your fitness goal. And then once you achieve the desired fitness level, then you can hike Gross Morn, then you can go to BC and hike the Black Tusk, and then eventually on to Kilimanjaro. Sports competition, pretty easy examples: run a 5K, run 1K, run a 5K, run a 10K, run a half marathon. So you can see that even though those goals may seem out of reach initially, there is a way to achieve them if you plan right. So a simple example for the landscaping example that I have here, and then we're basically wrapped up, I'll just walk you through an example of what a progression might be. So if you're looking to increase your capacity to walk for 2 hours within a half-day period, you should be aiming to do this a couple days a week, working at a comparatively low intensity, and then slowly increasing your time. And I probably could have had arrows here wherever you see the dashes, going from 2 to 5, 20 to 35, 20 to 120. These could all be arrows where you are slowly going to be increasing. Start with 2 days, then to 3, then to 5, then to 4, what have you, going from 20 to 30 to 40 and so on. These could all be progressions within themselves. Then when you're looking to plant flowers, you need to change the type of training, the exercise that you're doing. So you may increase the frequency a little bit. You're going to start working a little bit more hard at a higher intensity. You may up the average time that you're training for, and you may involve some walking as well as some calisthenics, because we know that planting flowers requires you to squat and kneel and stand up and adjust things. So you may want to incorporate some body weight based exercise at that point. And then when you get to the more physically demanding stuff, yeah, more days a week at a higher intensity for longer durations. That you can see we're up to 2 60-minute sessions a day, where you're doing some walking and some resistance training now. And these are just, and all of these slides will be available just as little prompts for you. But this is really how detailed goal setting needs to be if you're giving yourself the best chance at being successful with achieving whatever the long-term sort of health or achievement-based goals you're looking to achieve. So as a quick summary, we've talked about some of the long-term health risks associated with cancer treatments and how complex they are. We've discussed the role of exercise in helping to optimize health and survival in young adults. We've identified many of the major barriers to adopting a new exercise behavior, as well as strategies to overcome them. And then we've developed a plan, and we've given you the tools, at least, to develop a plan to safely start or increase your exercise participation. Remember, there are lots of reasons why you may want to start getting more active. Pick a reason, make a plan, and get moving. Yeah, so one of the ways that physios, especially physios that specialize in, say, like COPD care, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease care, would be a great resource, a professional resource to access, because they're trained to prescribe, or you can probably even find this stuff on YouTube. You can find anything on YouTube these days, just like controlled deep breathing exercises. Just pushing yourself, if your primary concern is lung function and you've had either some sort of fibrosis related to radiotherapy or some bleomycin related toxicity, or you've had part of your lung resected, you can gain confidence and capacity just by doing deep breathing exercises. And then with that, with repeated stress to that system, your system remodels in a positive way. And then that will sort of help decrease the breathlessness or the shortness of breath at rest. And then that would give you subsequent confidence to start trying something a little bit more movement based. And then it would just be a careful and slow progression. And if you're really concerned about whether or not you're getting enough oxygen and so on, you can buy very inexpensive O2 sat monitors that just slip over your finger. And if you're worried about whether or not your lungs are working well enough to give you the oxygen you need while you're training, slip it on. You want to be ideally around 98%. That's normal. You can see it start to dip down towards 94, 93, 92 when you really start working hard. And then if it gets below that, you'd want to probably back off the intensity a little bit, especially if you're training on your own. Start low and slow and build from there. I mean, again, listen to your body. There are simple tests that in the absence of equipment you can do to sort of gauge how hard you're working. So ideally, the easiest way to gauge intensity would be like a heart rate monitor, whether it's like a chest strap or a Fitbit watch type sort of device. They're getting like headphones now and headbands that are also having built-in heart rate monitors, which are really cool. So that would be the easiest and most sort of reliable way. But there are other ways that require no technology to assess. So one is the talk test. If you are, I think all of us at rest, I hope, are able to complete full sentences without stopping to need to take a breath of air. That would indicate that you're working at a very low intensity. Then when the intensity increases, you'll be able to get most of the way through a sentence without having to stop and take a breath. And then you'll be able to mostly easily maintain conversation with the person you're walking beside, what have you. And you can use that to gauge your intensity. If you have to interrupt sentences occasionally while you're exercising, that would indicate that you're working up towards a moderate intensity. But if you're only able to get a couple of words out every couple of seconds, and you're panting pretty hard in between trying to get your ideas out, that would indicate you're working at a vigorous intensity. And I love that this is being recorded, so that will be immortalized. That example will now be immortalized, so I can dwell in it for years to come. But it's called the talk test. It's a great way to just check in with yourself and learn to listen to your body more. Another tool that we use when we're doing exercise testing is rating of perceived exertion. And you can do this for our friend who had lung concerns. You can check in with your overall level of exertion as well as different kinds of effort or stresses. So let me unpack that. So the two different scales are like a 0 to 10 scale or a 1 to 10 scale and a 6 to 20 scale for rating of perceived exertion. Use either of them, whichever one you feel more comfortable with. You can Google those and download them and sort of check out. And then when you're doing whatever activity is that you're doing, or if you're learning how to listen to your body, you can use a heart rate monitor and ask yourself those RPE questions. So you can see that you're working at, say, like 40% or 50% of your max heart rate. And then you check in with yourself to say, okay, how hard am I working right now? Well, maybe it's like a 4 on 10, 5 on 10. And then you can better associate the feeling with how hard physically you're working. But then for people who have specific issues, say like lower limb weakness or lung complications, you can sort of check in differentially with yourself. So you could say, okay, overall, how hard am I working versus how hard am I breathing and my legs are mostly okay, or how much burning is happening in my leg muscles, but my lungs are pretty much okay, right? So you can start to check in with different aspects of your systems that allow you to move. In terms of when to know to stop, the best advice would be just to not bite off too much too soon. Start at lesser volumes and lesser intensities and progress slowly. Nobody needs to be in the gym for multiple hours a day. Start with 15 minutes of whatever it is you're doing, especially if you're trying something new like higher intensity exercise. Start with 5 minutes. If you tolerate that well, check in with yourself for the rest of the day after, if you're not totally wiped out by it. Then you should feel comfortable to go a little bit longer or to work a little bit harder the next time. The progression is the key. Oftentimes, and I'm guilty of this myself, when I want to do something new, I'm like, oh yes, that's the thing I want to do. And I dive in full steam ahead, and then I can't walk for 3 days. So I am just starting to work with a company called Pi Health. And they have their physical activity metric is called a Pi score. It's called the Pi score. It's Personal Activity Intelligence Score. One of the things I like about their system is, especially for people who are new to physical activity monitoring, it's one number. You don't need to worry about met hours and calculating everything out as much. It's one sort of number that you need to keep track of and try and achieve on a 7 day sort of average cycle. Their system is technology agnostic. So if you have an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or a Garmin or whatever the other sort of wearable devices are, it works with all of those. So that's the one that I'm using in a couple studies right now, and trying to validate it in young adults. So we will have some good info coming soon, as soon as research happens, on all of that. In terms of like, it's kind of the same answer as what exercise is best. Whichever device you will use and you find most easy to interact with and get the information you want from, is the one you should go with. I don't think there's a clear advantage of one product over another in terms of which smartwatch or heart rate monitor or physical activity monitor to use. Some will give you a ton of information, like Apple Watch gives you a ton of information. And we're actually testing an Apple Watch. We're doing a heart failure study with Apple, in partnership with Apple, actually, where we're getting a ton of biometric data from these watches. But some people don't need all of that information. Some people just want a quick and dirty metric of, did I do enough today? Yes or no, and move on. So you kind of want to pick whatever system is going to give you the outputs you need to help keep you as engaged as possible. There is good evidence in osteoporosis, and good evidence in that emerging in, like the one I showed earlier today, where doing some either impact exercise, so like walking or hopping or what have you, that compresses your bones longitudinally, that will strengthen lower extremity bones as well as pelvic and sort of spinal column, spinal vertebra. But beyond that, that's where if it's upper extremity bone health you would want to be trying to improve, you'd need to do some sort of resistance exercise using elastics or weights or body weight or what have you. Again, especially if there's a genetic predisposition to low bone mineral density, you'd want to make sure it's safe, and you'd want to start low and progress slow, because fracture would be the deal killer, right? Like once you fracture, then all your systems will atrophy due to disuse. So that's what you need to avoid for sure. Yeah, start low, progress slow. I guess that's the sort of hook that I keep going back to at this point. Bring the questions to the people that are best suited to address them. Your oncologists are not trained in nutrition and dietetics. Take those questions to a nutritionist or a dietitian. Your oncologists are very likely also not trained in exercise. So they won't be able to give you good specific advice as to what type of training you should be doing to optimize performance, or to how to avoid overtraining, if that is also a concern. The dietitians I've worked with in the past have been quite knowledgeable. For all of the conditioning related questions, I would refer you to kinesiologists, but I would look up local certified individuals who would be your best resource. The exercise fatigue story is so sort of counterintuitive. When you have no energy, why does it make sense that exercise is the thing that can help you get more energy, especially when exercise costs energy? What I will say is that when you look at, say, like the US Oncology Nursing Association, exercise is the only thing that is a standard recommendation for improving fatigue. Exercise, like I pointed out earlier in the presentation, it positively impacts so many different pathways that almost irrespective of what is causing your fatigue, exercise should be able to help to some degree. How do you sort of motivate yourself to move when you're, pardon the expression, on your ass with fatigue? And I think you can mobilize multiple sort of resources. You can, if you're watching TV, you can take commercial breaks, and you can do some just gentle body weight squat, stand up, move around, very small doses built into your otherwise sedentary time. You can get friends involved in saying, hey, can you come over and just like take me out for a 5-minute walk, and cycle through that. There are, the journaling piece is especially important once you have initiated the process of trying to get more active. Because what most people find is by keeping some sort of, even if it's just a very brief diary or journaled account of how they feel after, more often than not, they feel like they have more energy after they have done the activity. So keeping that sort of written account can help remind you in those moments of indecision or lack of motivation to, you know what, 7 out of the 8 last times I didn't feel like training and I got up and did a 5-minute workout or went for a walk around the block or what have you, I actually had more energy and was able to do one more thing when I came home. Having that sort of tangible proof and feedback to yourself can also serve as a motivating factor to actually initiate the movement. If you can break that cycle for long enough to engage in the exercise, then you
Exactly.
stand to benefit from it, which should result in a decrease in fatigue, which should make it less of a barrier the next time. Or your fatigue status will be cyclical. It will vary over time, especially in relation to proximity to treatments and so on, and moods and all sorts of other things. Prioritize it in your day. So do it at whatever time of day you have the most energy. And then hopefully after a couple cycles, couple weeks of prioritizing it when you have the most energy, you will have more windows where you have more energy. So you won't have to sacrifice other things for the sake of doing this type of work. There's those behavioral strategies, engage your support circle around you, leave physical reminders in your environment to be more active at very small increments throughout the day. And if you need supplemental support, certainly go talk to physicians about it, because sometimes it may just be decreasing that barrier to engagement initially that is required to allow you to sort of really engage in the exercise and then benefit from it in the long term.